Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
All right, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone. This can be a grim topic, and I'm going to try to keep the grimness to a minimum, but let's start just by glancing at the relevant facts. Every year, in the United States alone, thousands of children die of cancer. These deaths are slow, they are painful, they are terrifying. These children suffer horribly, their families suffer horribly. I had thought that I might try to make that more vivid, but I don't think that's necessary. Even if you have never been close to anything like that, if you're a human being, you can begin to imagine how awful it must be. Our job for tonight is to try to explore the religious significance of this kind of suffering, the intense, undeserved suffering of the innocent. I want to suggest in these opening remarks that this kind of suffering has a twofold significance. There are two distinct challenges to religious belief and to the religious life posed by this sort of suffering. One of them is intellectual, a challenge to the intellectual content of religion, and the other is ethical. The intellectual challenge is very familiar. You all know what it is, you've thought about it before. The ethical challenge may be somewhat less familiar. I'm going to present them both in highly schematic terms just to get them on the table, and the arguments will be elaborated as we go along. So let's start with the intellectual challenge to religious belief from the fact of intense, undeserved suffering. Let's suppose for a moment that there is a God of the sort envisioned by the great monotheistic traditions, a perfect God. A child dies slowly and painfully of cancer. What is God's relation to this death? Well, at a minimum, I think we know this. God allows it. God stands by and lets this child die slowly and painfully. God could easily prevent this death. God is omnipotent, after all. God could easily see to it that no child ever dies of cancer, but he doesn't. In fact, we could put the point more sharply. If God is the author of the world, the author of nature, its first cause, then God does not just allow these deaths, he causes them. Not directly, but via intermediaries, whose powers he knows and foresees. But to cause death is to kill. So if there is a God, he kills thousands of children every year, slowly and painfully. But this is evil. It is a grotesque moral wrong to kill a child under any circumstances. Even if you recoil at the suggestion that God is the author of these deaths, you must agree that he allows them when he could easily prevent them. But that is also wrong. It is grotesquely wrong to allow a child to die when you could easily save her life. So if there is a God, he is evil. But that's impossible. God is, by definition, by his very nature, a perfect being, and therefore perfectly good. So that's a contradiction. If there is a God, he is both perfectly good and evil. So there is no God. That is a version of what is sometimes called the argument from evil, what is probably better called the argument from suffering. If we had time, I could write this down for you and present it to you slowly and carefully as a rigorous deductive argument. And if I did that, I think you'd see that when you get right down to it, it has only one vulnerable premise. The premise that a good God would not kill children or allow them to die slowly and painfully. God moves in mysterious ways his wonders to perform, we're told. It is just barely possible that these deaths are somehow necessary for some great, great good that cannot be realized in any other way. Of course, we have no idea what this good could possibly be, or how these apparently pointless deaths could possibly be necessary for it, but it is not absolutely inconceivable that the misery and suffering that God allows might be justified in ways we cannot fathom. So the argument from evil is not a conclusive, deductive argument. The better way to think of it is this: the evil we find in nature, the intense, undeserved suffering we find in the world around us, is evidence. It is evidence that there is no perfect God. It is extremely powerful evidence that there is no perfect God. There is another hypothesis that is consistent with that evidence, that there is a perfect God who, for reasons we cannot begin to fathom, compatible with his goodness and justice, kills or allows to die thousands of children every year. We can discuss which of those hypotheses is better supported by the evidence we have. In my view, that is not a hard question. The evidence we have, taken in its totality, strongly supports, about as well as any argument in this part of philosophy or theology possibly can, the proposition that there is no perfect God. There might be a flawed God. I should say that now. If you think that although there is a God, he might be limited in his power, limited in his knowledge, limited in his goodness, like the gods of ancient Greece, then this argument does not touch you. But it does touch the God of the great monotheistic religions, or so it seems to me. But so what? Suppose I'm right, that the evidence goes strongly, strongly against the hypothesis that there is such a God. So what? Many Christians, many theists, actually I don't know so many Jews who will come out and say this, but many theists of my acquaintance will say, I believe without evidence. I believe in the teeth of the evidence. They don't call it faith for nothing. This faith is a comfort. This faith gives me strength. This faith in the teeth of reason is a virtue. It is the virtue around which my life is organized. So it's not reasonable. So what? There are more important things in the world than being reasonable. I actually take this point. I am not one of those censorious atheists who thinks of religious belief everywhere and always as an unpardonable crime against the intellect. That is not me. From my point of view, religious belief in the teeth of this evidence is wishful thinking. But I will agree that there are worse things in the world than wishful thinking. And this brings me to the ethical challenge to religious belief posed by the fact of suffering. Consider an analogy. I hope this isn't offensive. Suppose there were a family in which the husband routinely brutalizes the children in awful ways. His wife knows this. She sees it. She can't do very much about it. It would be distressing for her to believe that this was all for nothing, that her husband was a bad man, and that there was no reason, no justification for what he does. So she loves him. She has faith in him. She trusts him, and so comes to believe, even though she cannot imagine what it could possibly be, that there must be some reason for what he does, that it must be good that he does what he does to his children. I hope we can all agree that this sort of wishful thinking, this sort of faith, isn't harmless. This sort of wishful thinking isn't the kind of everyday irrationality against which there is nothing to be said. This kind of wishful thinking is pathological. It is a distortion of, I would say a perversion of, the normal human capacity for love and trust. There is nothing admirable in it. This kind of wishful thinking is not the sort of thing around which a good life for a human being can be organized. This sort of wishful thinking is pathetic. I used to think that the most important challenge to religious belief, from evil or from the other arguments one might offer, was intellectual. It used to be a powerful mystery to me, the philosophy professor, how anyone could believe that on the strength of the evidence we have. But I now think that the real problem isn't a problem about religious belief at all. It's a problem about religious devotion. The ethical question is, how can any decent person love and trust with all his heart a God who does what this God seems to do? How can any decent person organize his life around the praise and worship of a God who kills children, or at least allows them to die slowly and painfully when he could easily prevent it? This version of the problem of suffering is not an intellectual problem. It's a problem in the ethics of devotion. I, personally, am quite confident that there is no God. But if I came to think that there was, if I came to believe that there was an invisible, powerful, spiritual person whose will governs the universe, I would not love or trust him. I might credit that this being is responsible for some wonderful things, but he is also responsible for what seem to be unspeakable horrors. I would recoil in disgust or bewilderment. But I know that there are people in this room, people I know, my friends, people I respect, people who have thought more about this than I have, people who are smarter than I am, who don't respond in that way. The great mystery for me, posed by the fact of suffering, is not how is suffering to be understood, how to make sense of suffering. As an atheist, I am not surprised by the fact of suffering. There's the ethical challenge, what to do about it. But the fact of suffering does not constitute, as such, any sort of challenge to my atheism. The great challenge posed by suffering to me is what to make sense of the religious devotion I find around me. How can I see that devotion as anything but a distortion of the normal human capacity for love and trust? I would love to know an answer to that question. And that's one of the things I hope to get out of this conversation tonight.
Thank you. Professor Lennox.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for welcoming me so warmly. I feel greatly honored to be invited not only to this distinguished university, but to sit together with Gideon Rosen, who's very well known in the world of philosophy. And he has just presented you with one of the best formulations of this intensely excruciating problem that I have ever heard. And I agree with the moderator that Christians like myself have far too often not taken this kind of objection seriously. And I wish with all my heart to take it seriously, because my concern, having come from the Christian background I do, is for truth. And this is the hardest question we face. If I might personalize it for a moment, a few years ago, I nearly died. And medical intervention in the last few seconds of my life after I had said goodbye to my wife saved me. And people say to me, do you thank God for that? And I say, yes, but in that same year, my sister's daughter, aged 22, had an excruciating experience with a brain tumor and died. And I say to people, if I've nothing to say to my sister, then I better not say anything about myself. We all face this problem. And Gideon has put his finger on it brilliantly. and that is, how can I keep believing in a God when we're faced with this apparently very negative evidence? So I want to share with you one or two things. The word evil has been used quite frequently this evening, and we recognize that there's something evil about the excruciating deaths of children. But I would want to ask the question, where does this concept of evil come from if there is no God? Dostoevsky once wrote, "If there is no God, everything is permitted." And I spent a lot of time discussing this with colleagues in Russia. And I remember several of them saying to me, you know, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We found we couldn't, and we discovered Dostoevsky was right. So one of my problems would be, if there is no God, and we are simply the end product of a mindless set of natural processes, where do we get the concept of good and evil from anyway? Now, I haven't, unfortunately, had the chance to talk to Gideon in detail before, but I wonder, does he take the view of Richard Dawkins, who takes his atheism to this conclusion, that the universe is, as he says, just as you would expect it to be. If at bottom there is no good, there is no evil, there is no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, the interesting thing to my mind about that, and many of the contemporary views of morality, like that of E.O. Wilson and Michael Ruse, for instance, who tells us that morality is simply an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate, is to undermine the very concepts of good and evil. So I have an intellectual problem, a very serious one, with the atheist position. Where do you get this sense of moral evil from that you use to criticize God? Now, building on that, the interesting thing to me is this. I suspect that our moral values are very similar. That we will say something is evil, both of us the same. I have no difficulty in agreeing with Gideon on this. But the next interesting thing is those moral precepts that we're using to do the assessment, all of them are to be found in the Bible. Now, here's a very interesting anomaly, isn't it? The very thing we're using to evaluate this whole thing as evil is part of the biblical claim that it is the revelation of the character of God who is this way. So there appears to be a contradiction. There appears to be a very real contradiction. And I agree with Gideon here that I have a problem, and I take it very seriously indeed. So my first major issue with the atheist position is it seems to me to give me no grounds for morality, just as a scientist I tell my atheist friends frequently that their atheism gives me no grounds for the rationality with which I do science. But the next step in this is coming to the question of solution of the problem. And I think you touched on this, Gideon, when you mentioned what we need to do is something about the suffering. Because when I debated this with Dawkins, he said, look, the atheist position is bleak, but we have to face it, that's the way it is. It's raw and it's bleak. Well, I admit it's raw and it's bleak, but that doesn't prove it's either true or it's false. And we need to investigate this, because one thing I notice, that if I conclude from observing nature and natural disasters and pain that there is no God, I have solved the problem in one sense, but I certainly haven't solved it in another. I'm left with the pain and the suffering. What I have done, of course, is remove all possibility of hope. Because by definition, atheism leaves us in a universe that's closed off at both ends. And that, to my mind, is a doorway into a possibility. Ladies and gentlemen, I wouldn't want to insult you or anybody else by thinking there are simplistic solutions to this problem. I don't think there are. But I feel that there are ways into it that allow one to face it without being guilty of what Gideon says, believing in the teeth of evidence and a faith that is wishful thinking. I feel also, and I suspect he would expect me to say this, that atheism can also be a manifestation of wishful thinking. If there is no God, Freud gives you a brilliant argument for imagining that religion is wishful thinking, if there is no God. Of course, if there is a God, Freud gives you an equally brilliant argument for atheism, so that you are wishfully thinking you'll never have to meet God. So it cancels each other out. And as the brilliant German psychiatrist Manfred Lutz pointed out, whether there is a God or not, Freudian arguments won't help you at all. You'll have to look elsewhere. Now, it seems to me there are complex things going on here. I got to Christchurch 2 days after the earthquake. I had to change every lecture I gave. I was on radio, television. I had to meet people who'd lost their wives, their husbands. I had to meet the pastors in Christchurch less than a week after that catastrophe. And my heart went out to these people. What can you say about earthquakes? And when you think about earthquakes, it's a very curious thing, because when you learn a little bit about plate tectonics, you will discover that they appear to be essential for life. Now, that's very odd, because here is something within the earth itself that appears to be essential for life, but it's destroying life. The earth is doing what it does. Now, of course, philosophically, that immediately leads to the question, can you have a world in which there's fire that doesn't burn, in which there's electricity that doesn't kill, in which there are bugs or no bugs that don't mutate and replicate and so on? And it seems to me we can argue from now to infinity, and we've been doing it for many centuries, of course, and we're doing it tonight, about these things. And there's no satisfactory way of second-guessing the character of God. And Gideon has hinted at this, I think very honestly, that if there is a perfect God, what exactly do we mean by perfect? Because we see these imperfections in the world. Now, he hasn't touched on the problem of moral evil, because I think from his perspective, the bigger problem is the problem of pain, and I agree with that entirely. But we cannot dissociate the problem of moral evil from the problem of pain, for the simple reason that a lot of the natural evil in this world is caused by moral evil. People deforest countries, and therefore children starve. And so there's a long connected chain. And it fascinates me that in the major biblical books that deal with this, the famous wonderful Jewish book of Job, he brings those two questions in at the start. Job's children were affected by an invasion of Sabaeans, that's moral evil, and by lightning. They were killed, that's natural evil. And the two come together, and I suspect there may be a deeper connection than sometimes we realize. But how do I see my way into this? Well, ladies and gentlemen, very briefly, we can go into this in a few minutes. It's this. The central claim of the Christian faith is that Jesus is God incarnate, and that he died on a cross. Now, I know this will be very difficult for some of you, but just come with me a minute. If this really is God, the question that arises in my mind is this: what is God doing on a cross? And the one thing it tells me is this, that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has become part of it. Now, if it stopped there, that would be no good. But if that is really God, and we have evidence for it, and here I come to the evidential side, the reason I'm not sitting where Gideon sits, the reason I don't accept his argument, there's only one major reason, otherwise I'd be with him. It's that I believe the resurrection of Jesus Christ has demonstrated that death is not the end. And that therefore, God, who is a good God, will eventually compensate and make right and do justice, and it be seen to be done. You see, the word justice hasn't come up this evening until now. You notice my quote from Dawkins. He says the world is just as you'd expect it to be, where there's no good, no evil, and no justice. As human beings, we cry out for justice. If death is the end, the vast majority of human beings will never get justice, by definition. They won't get it in this life, and there's no next life to get it in. So it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, although the arguments are powerful, very powerful, and we all feel the pain of them, at least I've seen in life a reason why so many millions of people, even in the age before anesthetics, believed in God in spite of the natural evil and the pain they saw around them, because they came to believe that however desperate the situation, there is ultimate hope. And I firmly believe, ladies and gentlemen, I firmly believe that if we could see what God does with the innocent children that will die during the time of this lecture, we might have no more questions to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt for one brief moment. This would be a very good time to write down some questions, but I'm going to invite Gideon to offer some remarks by way of response, and then John, if you have a few words, and then I'll start our conversation with some questions of my own.
Thanks, John. I certainly don't accept the view that you attributed to Dawkins and to Dostoevsky, that if there is no God, there is no good and evil, there is no right and wrong, there is no justice. In fact, I said in my own voice, it is a grotesque moral wrong to kill children slowly and painfully. That I firmly believe. You ask where our concepts of good and evil come from. I think of that as an obscure psychological question. Where does our concept of God come from? Where do our concepts of numbers come from? Who knows and who cares? The question isn't where the concept comes. The question is not where the concept comes from. To suppose that only God could have given us this concept it's like saying, where does the rain come from? I don't know. God must have made it. There is a good scientific question where moral concepts come from. Someday we'll know the answer to it. We don't now. To suppose that it could only have come from God is to make the kind of mistake that a certain kind of theist, not you, has made down through the centuries, of supposing that what we can't now explain or understand in ordinary scientific terms must be the immediate work of God. That's, to me, not an especially persuasive argument. I think the real question you're asking, and the one that really is raised by the bit from Dostoevsky, is not where do our concepts of good and evil come from, but what makes certain acts right or wrong? What makes certain events or certain happenings or certain states of the soul good or bad? And from my point of view, it's first of all evident that the suffering of the innocent is bad. That is, it seems to me, just a manifest fact of experience. I don't need God to tell me that it's so, and it's certainly the case that throughout history, without the benefit of revealed religion, it has been obvious to every thinking human being that the suffering of the innocent is bad. God doesn't need to tell us these things, and God doesn't need to make them so. I don't see how God could possibly make it so that the suffering of the innocent is bad. It's as if you imagine a world in which there are innocent people, they suffer, and then God comes along and said, let that be bad. How could that possibly work? There is a good question in moral philosophy of what the fundamental ground of value is. What makes the good things good? What makes the bad things bad? What makes the right acts right? What makes the wrong acts wrong? Those are very good, very difficult questions. I don't see how God could possibly be part of the answer. If God says, let murder be wrong, how does his saying so make it so? I can say it. I can say, let drinking water be wrong. But I have no authority. There is no moral reason for you to take my command seriously. If there is a moral reason to take God's command seriously, this is an ancient argument, then God can't have put it in place. No being who doesn't already have moral authority can possibly confer moral authority upon himself. So there must be at least one moral fact that is not instituted by God. Maybe it's the fact of God's authority, maybe it's the badness of pain, but there's no fundamental mystery as to how there could be a moral fact that wasn't instituted by the say-so of a being, divine or otherwise. Moral principles are not like laws. The laws we have that govern us are made by human beings, and they do not exist unless someone puts them in place. The fact that it is wrong to cause pain to the innocent for fun, the fact that you are morally required to save the life of a child when you easily can, is not the sort of fact that was put in place by anyone, as I see it, because I don't see how it could possibly have been put in place by anyone. On the suggestion that atheism seems to you a sort of wishful thinking, I would just ask the audience to think, I suppose all of you disbelieve in Zeus and the other Olympian gods. If I say, according to you, what's the probability that Zeus exists? I bet it's pretty close to 0 for all of you.
There's some freshmen here that might.
Very good.
My wife had a good classical education, and she came out a senior, taking a serious interest in the gods of ancient Greece. That's the kind of education she had, so it can be done. Does your inclination to doubt the existence of the Olympian gods strike you as wishful thinking? Well, let me say, having looked deep into my own soul about this, I feel exactly the same way about the God of these monotheistic traditions as I feel about the gods of ancient Greece. The hypothesis that such things exist just leaves me cold and strikes me as obviously false, given all the experience I've had. It's possible that you have some deep psychoanalytic insight into what's really pushing my buttons. I doubt it. I think that this is just one of those things that, if the skies parted and I heard some booming voice announcing, "I am that I am," I'd come around. My commitment here is not dogmatic, but it is, I think, just an ordinary empirical response to my experience. If it's wishful thinking, that would be a big surprise to me.
Well, that voice has already come. And he claimed that he was, "I am that I am." And the reason I am a Christian is precisely because I believe that claim is true. But let's go back to what you were saying there, Gideon. I didn't hear many arguments for atheism there. And I really do wonder whether it's a little bit too facile to approach it that way, because so many, I see, of the atheist writers I read do take this to its logical conclusion. And that is that the atheistic worldview, which is reductionist and reduces us all to physics and chemistry, actually destroys more than morality. As Nietzsche saw very clearly, it destroys both truth and meaning. And I didn't actually hear any arguments against that. What I did hear, though, was this, that the knowledge that these things are evil is something obvious. I would agree with you 100%. But I think there's an explanation of why it's obvious. It's that you and I, whether we believe it or not, I believe it, you don't, but that you and I were made in the image of God as moral beings, and therefore we have a moral perception, and it's common to all of us. And that's why we realize it is obvious. What I am claiming, and still would claim very strongly, is that the atheist worldview undermines that. Now, I'm very glad you did put in there, and I thank you for complimenting me on it, that I'm not a God of the gaps man, that I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But I think that David Hume did have a point when he observed, as you know, that people in dialogue often shifted from an is to an ought, and they appeared to derive moral categories from simply what is. And the point has been well made that people have been trying it ever since. You see, if you get rid of God, the transcendent source of morality, you are shut up to finding your morality from down here. And one of the things that I believe leads to enormous moral confusion today is precisely that. Once you try to base your morality in here, well, you can base almost any morality. For instance, if you study animal behavior, and it's been done and attempted to be applied. And losing that transcendent dimension seems to me to lead to moral confusion, which is an added evidence, not a proof, an added evidence that a morality that's connected with God is the definitive morality. Now, you mentioned this ancient problem, is it good because God said so, and so on. I think that's the Euthyphro problem. I believe the confusion there lies between confusing God's will and his character. Of course, I believe that God is the definition of good, and that's not a contradiction of terms. The buck must stop somewhere, wherever you trace back the origin of good. And then on the final point, atheism, and I smiled when you mentioned your disbelief in Zeus. I see we're both Azeusists. And I would add to that I'm an Awotanist as well, just so that you'd know. And Richard Dawkins made this point to me during one of the debates, and he says, well, I'm just an atheist. I just go one God further. And I categorize the God of the great monotheistic gods with all the others. I said, do you really? Because I've never read a book by you on Azeusism, but I've read mature books on atheism. Now, why is that? It's because it's not a trivial matter at all. Because although atheism is a negative word, it carries with it, when you flip it upside down, the whole positive philosophy of naturalism, which is an entire world view. Now, of course, the reason that we reject Zeus and so on and the Greek gods was seen long ago by Xenophanes, that they were projections of the imagination. And the question we need to face is the God revealed in Scripture also a projection of the imagination? And again, I come back to it. Now, this extends our discussion inevitably, because it raises the question, what is the evidence for the existence of God? Is it all contained simply in moral discourse? I think that's a very important part of it. In fact, it was this very discourse that led C.S. Lewis to leave his atheism and become a Christian when he inquired about the source of morality. But I want to go back much further and say that my evidence for believing in such a God and trusting in him has to do with a great variety of things, including the fact I can do science, including history, particularly the history concerning Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, and my own personal experience. And Gideon ended talking about his experience. That's the very interesting thing, Gideon. I'd be interested to know, and it applies to both of the same question, do you bring your atheism to your experience, or does it flow out of it?
Before you answer that, this would be a good time if you want to pass your note cards to the aisle, and those of you who are helping us out by collecting them, please go ahead and collect them and bring them up to me whenever you're ready. So, sorry to interrupt very quickly.
Can I say a few words while they're doing that?
All right. If we could do this as quietly as possible, Gideon's going to respond.
Let me just say a few words. First of all, I think it's just a mistake to suppose that atheism brings a worldview with it. Azeusism brings no worldview with it. Atheism, in particular, doesn't entail naturalism. I'm not a naturalist. I don't believe that the fact that the suffering of the innocent is bad, the fact that it's wrong to cause the suffering of the innocent, is a natural fact. It's not the sort of fact that can be established by ordinary scientific inquiry. It's a moral fact.
Yes,
and this is, in
Just 1 second. Perhaps we're talking about different things. By naturalism, I mean simply the worldview that there's no supernature. Not a natural materialism, if you like, the Oxford Compendium of Philosophy. Perhaps you can sort me out here, but they don't seem to be able to make a distinction between naturalism and materialism. I certainly agree with that point that you've just made. I'm talking that, let me say it succinctly, atheism is a worldview that excludes the supernatural. This universe or multiverse is all that exists. And that's a worldview because it's applied to answering the big questions of existence. That's what we mean by a worldview. So is that fair?
No, I don't think so. There's a kind of, it excludes God. So if the denial that God exists is by itself a worldview, fine, it's a worldview.
Yeah, okay.
I am actually not, in that sense, a naturalist either.
Okay.
That is, not only do I believe that there are moral facts that are not identical with the kinds of ordinary empirical facts that can be determined by ordinary scientific means, I believe that there are objects that aren't part of the natural world.
Well, that's wonderful. I agree with you, of course.
I just don't think they're gods. I think they're numbers.
Well.
You did say you looked into your own soul as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, he is on my side in mathematics, absolutely.
But this is just to say that you've been reading too much Dawkins and too much Hitchens.
Oh, I
agree with those guys about one thing.
What's that?
That there is no God.
Right.
The rest, every sensible atheist, from Voltaire on, has been clear as a bell that their atheism was fully compatible with a confident moralism. Hume was a great moralist.
I've no doubt about
Voltaire
that.
was a great moralist. John Stuart Mill was a great moralist. Peter Singer is a great moralist. If there is an argument from atheism to the proposition that nothing is right or wrong, I would love to see it. I can guarantee you Dostoevsky did not supply it. Nietzsche did not supply it. I've never seen it.
Well, you don't have to convince me because I agree with you. And I think I'm glad you raised the point because Dostoevsky was not claiming that atheists couldn't be moral. What he was claiming is there's no ultimate rational justification for morality on the basis of atheism. That's a different matter. My atheist friends are some of the most moral people I know. They put me to shame. That's not at issue.
What's at issue is whether the atheist can consistently, as a philosopher,
that's exactly
accept
right.
the existence
that's
of
exactly
right and wrong.
And they haven't convinced me yet.
Maybe we can... We're not talking about the problem of suffering anymore. And I suspect that's because...
It's the moderator's fault.
But we...
Let me take us back to the suffering. Not our suffering listening, but could we collect the note cards? I have a question for each of you.
Okay.
And it picks up on things that both of you said, but primarily let me frame it in terms of Gideon's helpful distinction between the intellectual challenge and the ethical challenge. So first to Professor Lennox. Some people worry that trying to make theological sense of suffering is misguided. And here I'm thinking of some fellow Christians, that it's led Christians to justify all sorts of horrendous things in the name of making intellectual sense of a damaged world, as if this world were the best of all possible worlds. So, for example, one prominent Oxford philosopher tried to justify the suffering of the Holocaust because of the opportunities for virtue that it provided responders to the victims. And many people find that deeply offensive, right? Especially to victims of genocide, incest, famine, or the tortured like those that trouble Ivan Karamazov. Others worry that when Christians try to intellectually respond to this question, they valorize suffering as something that brings you closer to God, even the crucified God of Christianity. So the general tone of my question is, in the Bible, Job's friends seem to go downhill once they start talking and giving answers. But in your answer, I heard you trying to say that we shouldn't make a lazy appeal to faith and mystery. You did want to say something like God permits suffering to bring about maybe a greater good, or that the victims of suffering will be compensated. You use the word compensated. So I guess the question is, do we make sense of suffering, whether suffering that comes through natural causes or moral evils? Should a Christian respond in silence, in companionship with those who suffer, by trying to relieve suffering, but not try to justify it? Or is that a cop-out? Is that the kind of faith in the teeth of reason that Gideon worries about? So I guess this is, how should a Christian approach this question of making sense? Should it be the intellectual justification? Or if we resist that, is that a kind of fideism that you think Christians should reject?
Well, let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to an oncologist than to someone who's just been told she's 3 months to live. There's a treating of this problem that's from observation. You're watching and you're intellectualizing. There's meeting people who are suffering. And I think unless we're aware of the deep pastoral aspect to this, we are going to walk into a lot of problems that you suggest. I've been in Auschwitz many times because I have many close Jewish friends. I've wept every time. I have no way of rationalizing that kind of evil. And as I said before, I've no intellectually subtle ways of answering it like a mathematical equation. And it strikes me, you know, that when Jesus was in the presence of a family that had been devastated by the death of a man, it was just a little family. But then, you know, an earthquake that kills thousands has the same effect on an individual that an earthquake in the brain has on one individual. And I often think of that little family. It's a story about two women, Mary and Martha. The brother Lazarus dies, and Jesus appears to let the man die. And when he comes and finds them weeping in a graveyard, one of them has massive intellectual difficulties, and there ensues a tremendous discussion about the resurrection. The other woman, Mary, is weeping, and what Jesus does is he stands and weeps with her. And I firmly believe that that stance is vastly important, because this attempt, the word justify, I think, is the dangerous word here, because this is far bigger than anything else we have to deal with. We've said it often enough, but it's worth repeating. This is the hardest question. And I don't feel I've got answers. What I feel is there's a series of doorways into possibilities, and I've seen them effective in the lives of people to change them from despair to hope. And so my experience at that level is extremely positive. It doesn't mean I've got all the answers, not remotely, but it certainly makes me very sensitive to the kind of point that you're making. Does that make sense to you, or am I not answering your question?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the analogy of the oncologist who's trying to maybe offer a diagnostic.
Yes, he's on the outside of the problem.
The intellectual challenge.
Yes. And
yet the person who suffers as best as one can with a sufferer is meeting the ethical challenge. It just seems to me a lot of the Christian tradition has tried to offer a solution. And you said you didn't offer a simplistic solution, but you still think that there should be an effort at a solution rather than an appeal to incomprehensibility.
Could I put it this way? I believe God's a person, not a theory.
Yeah.
So often in many of these things, the solution lies in a deep personal relationship. Solution's a bad word. And coming to have confidence in God and seeing the way people respond and their belief in God to suffering and all this kind of thing builds up evidence in my heart that this is the right direction to go. And it seems to me that there's very powerful evidence, certainly in my experience of that, and it cogs into everything that the Bible claims about it. But I think we must be immensely sensitive.
Maybe a version of the same question, but more oriented towards the ethical challenge in the way Gideon framed it. And I'm going to be slightly unfair, but Gideon is a colleague and a friend, so I can appeal to a recent interview he gave in the New York Times, where he said that, quote, I don't think about death that much. And I took the claim to argue that against the view, and this goes to some of the conversation, that without God, or some cosmic significance to the world as a whole, our lives have no meaning. And he was arguing against this view and suggested in the article or in the interview that the experience of the ordinary values, or as he put it here, the normal human capacity for love and trust, make life worth living. So we shouldn't be in the grip of existential angst about the problem of nihilism that Dawkins or others might offer, or the problem of theism that Christians promote, or the existence of God. So can you say a little bit more? Did I get you right? And can you say how it relates to making sense of suffering?
There is a sense that one can sometimes get that if our lives are finite, just minuscule drops in the cosmic bucket, then it doesn't matter how they go. Nothing matters unless it matters from the point of view of the universe. And if there is no point of view of the universe that takes a special interest in me, then nothing matters. And insofar as I find meaning and value in things, that's just an illusion. The clear-headed view is that it doesn't matter whether I live or die. It doesn't matter whether the children suffer or not. That's a view that I fundamentally reject. In the context of that odd New York Times interview, I was trying to get some sense of why people might be tempted by this sort of view. And I do think that when you think especially vividly about your own death, you get a kind of glare thrown up that makes it hard to see how any of the things that otherwise strike you as valuable and meaningful could really have any kind of value and meaning at all. And the point of that remark is just to say, the glare that's thrown up when you are vividly confronted with your own finitude isn't a moment of real insight into how the world really is. It's a kind of distortion or illusion. If you want to know where value lies in life, take the ordinary experiences of value that are part of everyday life, and I'm not going to get all soppy about where I happen to find this kind of value. There is no reason whatsoever from philosophy, from psychology, or from any other authoritative discipline I know, to think that when you spend time with your kids having fun playing around in the yard, that the experience isn't, that the event isn't, the thing you're doing with them isn't of genuine value, the kind of value that you legitimately take satisfaction in, the kind of value which, when it accumulates properly in a life, gives that life value even if the life is only finite. That's my spiel about the experience of ordinary value. The fact is, there's a flip side to that. There is the experience of abysmal suffering, or the experience of ordinary suffering. We don't have to get all dramatic about it. And the fact is, I think, that is a perfectly authentic experience also. The world is a mixed bag. Our lives are a mixed bag. Some lives are so suffused with suffering that they are not redeemed, not made lives worth living by the bits of good that happen to figure in them. That's the way it goes. Our job as moral agents is to do what we can to see to it that we and the rest of us live lives that are worth living. That's not, as I see it, a religious project. It's not a project that presupposes the existence of God. It's an ordinary ethical project.
But there's no ultimate justice in your view.
There is no...
Really not. Because you believe that death is the end.
No, and there isn't for you either, as far as I can tell. The child who suffers and dies may have a second life of infinite felicity. But that's not justice. If I torture a child for a while for my own purposes, and then fix him up, give him a lot of money, buy him an excellent house, see to it that the rest of his life, however long, is an excellent life. Maybe I even manage to arrange the kind of therapy that erases or mitigates the memory of the torture he underwent, none of that will render my unwarranted infliction of agony just.
That's exactly right. It will not. And therefore you will face judgment for it, ultimately before God. That's exactly what I believe.
And before whom will God face judgment? God does just what I did in that example. God torments innocent children. I didn't mean to be this polemical, but God torments innocent children for his own reason. He may compensate them later, but that cannot make it all right for him to do what he did.
I think you're going further than you did in your opening talk. God allows it to happen. To say that he directly does it, I think.
I didn't say he directly does it.
Well, when you say God torments, that sounds like the normal reading of that opinion.
God initiates a causal chain.
It depends on the meaning of what the word is.
Sorry, I was getting worked up.
You see, it's a.
But John, can I just ask you about?
Of course you can.
I find this rhetorical question, this verbal question, pretty important. God definitely allows the suffering we see.
I agree with you. We can't escape that.
He doesn't cause it directly as far as we know. But he does cause it indirectly.
In that he created a universe in which it's possible.
No, he created, take the natural suffering that we're talking about, the suffering at the hands of nature, not as the result of the free acts of other human beings. Mm-hmm. God didn't just foresee that it was possible that this child might get cancer. Mm-hmm. He foresaw that this child would get cancer.
Well, that's assuming a great deal that you know about God's relationship with time. That his seeing it beforehand, whatever that means, is causation. I would question that, and I think a lot of philosophers would question it too. I think God's relationship with time may be a lot more subtle than that. I think that's a path that would be a bit leery of going down as something definitive, to be honest with you. But
the benefits that people get are no more God's doing than the...
No, the key thing for me is this, that I agree with you so much when I hear you talking about the values of family and so on. And they're wonderful. But is that all there is? And you talk about injustice, and we've now brought it into the realm of moral injustice. Am I to think that somebody can gas 6 million Jews and get away with it just by putting a gun to their head? I just don't believe that. You know, we live in a world where people have appetite for food. There is food. We live in a world where people have an appetite for sex. There is sex. And we live in a world where people have appetite for justice, and there's none. Really? I mean, that doesn't prove anything. But it seems to me, again here, that the biblical worldview is one of a piece. It says, yes, there will be a final judgment. People will be called to book for what they've done in abusing children and so on. And I think that is a wonderful thing. I mean, the Jewish Psalms are utterly full of this. Let the mountains sing, let the trees clap their hands, because God is coming to judge the world. You know, when we think of judgment, we think it's grim and grey. They didn't, because they raised the big question, when is God ultimately going to do something about it? Now, you argue at the beginning that a good and perfect God would do something about it. I claim, for some reason that I don't know completely, he hasn't yet, but he will do. But it seems to me the atheist doesn't like that either, the fact that God will ultimately do something. That seems to be a very curious position to adopt. So that's really my view of that. Gosh, you've got a lot of questions.
I have a lot of questions, or you have a lot of questions. I'm a moderator.
Oh, I thought you were going to answer them.
Well,
now.
Okay. I do have maybe one more follow-up question for Gideon, and I think this goes a lot with, I just want to get clear in my mind your view. Some Christians suggest that an atheist doesn't have conceptual resources to be really upset about suffering.
That's wrong.
They say the only reasonable option for the atheist is to shrug shoulders in the face of suffering. But obviously you're making a kind of claim of value judgments and appeals to justice. John mentioned C.S. Lewis. I had a quote from C.S. Lewis where he says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust?" What do you think of Lewis's argument there?
We have abundant experience of justice. Sometimes people get what they deserve. Sometimes virtue is rewarded. If all it takes is the experience of a straight line to give you the capacity to distinguish the straight from the crooked, ordinary experience is filled with experience of good and bad, right and wrong, justice and injustice.
On that,
And let me just add, suppose I confessed uncertainty about where our conception of the just comes from. It would be an appeal to the God of the gaps, to suppose that since we cannot now explain the origin of this concept, it must have come from God. That's the last thing one should think, confronted with an ordinary empirical mystery.
But wait a minute, there's another way of approaching that, and that is inference to the best explanation. I would much prefer an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't. And therefore, the idea that there's a personal God who is a moral being who's behind the universe and guarantees that our conscience is corresponding to something real, that makes infinitely more sense than behind the universe there is nothing, and we are simply the end product of mindless, unguided processes. It's not a question of a God of the gaps. It's a question of, is there an explanation that makes sense and is consistent, and is it better than other explanations? And so, I don't think to call that a God of the gaps is totally fair.
The God of the gaps is inference to the best explanation run amok.
Oh, well, I would agree with that.
that's one agreement we have for those of you keeping score.
And I shall use that. I think that's very good.
I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience, but I was interested in one final question, and I appreciate how both of our speakers have really tried to step down from abstract considerations of suffering. But we've been talking mainly about victims of suffering. So I thought I would just ask, from both of your perspectives, how do you make sense, or what do you think about, or maybe even what would you say to perpetrators of suffering? A theme that's in a lot of great literature about living with one's own guilt after causing suffering. So how do you make sense of having perpetrated great suffering, particularly given that most of us here live among the privileged in a world that has lots of great suffering? We don't have to get into whether or not we are the cause of that harm, but a great Christian theme is the reconciliation of the perpetrator and the victim. But your comments about Hitler provoked this question. What does Christianity have to say to perpetrators of suffering?
Well, I am one. I've caused suffering, ladies and gentlemen. I suspect you may have. And it faces me, this question. Of course it does. And the whole matter of forgiveness. And the crucial issue of repentance. And I think this is a very deep and important problem, of course. I've caused suffering, possibly deliberately, certainly inadvertently. Some of the things I've said in my life have hurt people. And therefore, before I start talking about the great perpetrators of suffering, I bring it right down to myself. What about me? And this is, of course, again, forgive me, but this is what we're talking about tonight, where the Christian faith is very real to me. I am a forgiven man. The biggest thing in my life is that awareness that all the things I've done wrong, Christ died for them, and I've been forgiven them. And therefore, that puts me under an obligation to repent and forgive other people. Now, the dynamics of that are very important. It seems to me repentance is very necessary before there can be forgiveness. I come from a country where some poor woman is faced with a microphone and she's just had her daughter murdered by a terrorist. And the reporter says, "Now you're a Christian, do you forgive her?" An absurd thing, because to forgive someone who doesn't repent is to condone it. And one of the most brilliant books on this topic, I'm sure you've read it, is The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal. Very moving book about this whole question, and it's certainly something that needs discussing in our society, and it flows out of this. If I've been causing suffering, then I need to do something about it, and I may need to go to my wife and children and repent and ask their forgiveness. And that is just a little microcosm of the big thing. in the relationship with the God who loves me.
Gideon.
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you say?
Well, maybe I didn't either, Gideon.
What do you say to the
Better answer than
perpetrator?
a question. So.
What do you say to Hitler? No words would be sufficient. Someone like that deserves.
But let's just say a rapist.
What do I say? I say you should crawl into a hole and die. If your victim forgives you, terrific. I'm in no position to forgive, and I think by the same token, God is in no position to forgive. Only the victims are in a position to forgive. If your victims have forgiven you, John, as far as I'm concerned, you're done. God has no stake. God can resolve not to punish you now that your victims have forgiven you, but it's some kind of conceptual mistake, I think, to suppose that God can literally forgive you for what you did to them. That's...
Yes, unless I take the point. It's a point that Christopher Hitchens made to me in a debate.
So it's not all bad.
What?
So it's...
Yes. My answer to it is that this is an issue that was raised centuries ago when Jesus forgave a man his sin, and the people were absolutely, they said, how absurd. How can he step in and forgive my sin when I've sinned against you and you haven't done anything about it? But if he was God, I think it makes all the difference. Because of course sin, if it is sin, is ultimately against God. And when you ask about Hitler, I didn't comment on Hitler. I'd like to ask Gideon, wouldn't you like to think, Gideon, that Hitler will face judgment before God for what he did?
Yeah, but I'm not so inclined to wishful thinking. That'd be great. I had the same fantasies of posthumous...
But it's not fantasy if the Judeo-Christian tradition is true.
Right. And it is fantasy, so the tradition is false. No, I don't mean that to be an argument.
No, well, it isn't clearly.
That is...
I didn't take it as one.
Let's now we're going to move to a very rapid fire serial questions. And to first, Professor Rosen, what makes you skeptical about the existence of God but not of the existence of morality? What is the distinction between wishful thinking about God and wishful thinking about morality?
Is that a rapid fire question? Poor man.
30 seconds, please.
I think ordinary experience supports the idea that some things are right and some things are wrong, some things are good, some things are bad, and nothing in ordinary experience or in science or in philosophy goes against it. God is supposed to be a causal entity, something that has some causal relation to the world and whose existence and whose nature explain features in the world. As far as I can tell, nothing in the world as I experience constitutes evidence for the, not nothing, but on balance. The world as I experience does not supply evidence for the existence of God, and in fact, the suffering that we've been talking about is exhibit number one in the case furnished by experience against the existence of God. So nothing in experience goes against the idea that some things are right and wrong. Quite a lot in experience goes against the existence of a perfect God.
Okay. We can go back and forth, but if you have comments on, then this is for Professor Lennox. Why must Christians insist on a perfect God? I think this was relevant to Gideon's remarks about maybe there is a God, but it's a limited God. So why must Christians insist on a perfect God?
Well, I think the question is really, your Father in heaven is perfect, is to ask the question, what exactly does that mean? I haven't heard a definition of it. Because the difficulty is with us that we have our notions of perfection. You know, what would perfection mean? And we instinctively think perfection would mean a world in which there was no evil and all this kind of thing. Well, yes, God could have made a world like that. I could have had a robotic wife. I go home to her tomorrow and I press the button marked kiss and I get a robotic kiss. Well, that would be marvelous, wouldn't it? the point is that it seems to me that it's far more complex than that. I've brought children into the world. I remember holding the first one and thinking, you know, you could grow up to reject me. Why did I bring you into the world? I took a risk. I'm not getting much sympathy from you guys. But you see the point, that I took the risk. Every parent does. Why is that? Because the kind of thing Gideon was talking about is valuable. Now, would you say, a God is perfect who only produces an automatic world so there's no possibility of anything going wrong? Or a God is perfect who produces a world in which there's the possibility of love? You see, the thing is much more complex than this kind of question allows. And
so to have the possibility of love, does that put limits on God or what God can be or do? Because if God intervenes in certain ways that makes us robots, then that threatens us.
Well, of course that's right. Yes, of course that's right. You know, C.S. Lewis once put it like this, you know, God cannot create a square circle. And nonsense remains nonsense even if you talk it about God. Right. So,
does God suffer?
The possibility of God. Well, of course, God is a person. And that brings us back to what I was saying at the beginning. What is the cross all about? Now, we don't even understand energy, ladies and gentlemen. We don't know what it is. We can use it. So don't expect me to understand the vast mystery of the being of God, who in himself has relationship. He is a fellowship, not a monolithic being. And it would seem to me that one of the things that we find in the revelation of God is that God does have feelings. We are made in his image. We have feelings. It's a part of being a person. And the infinite dignity that God has conveyed on us in making us persons is something that I wonder at every day. So, yes, my answer to it is, however it works out, there is a real suffering, and on the cross it was seen at its highest extent.
Professor Rosen, must you not have faith in reason in order to believe anything that you deduce and reduce via reason? I guess this is, do you have faith in reason?
Faith, if faith just means believing something without being in a position to give an argument for it or to give evidence for it, then I have faith in all kinds of things. I am actually, part of what I meant when I said that I'm not one of those censorious atheists who thinks that religious belief is an unpardonable sin, comes from this thought. One of the great lessons from the history of modern philosophy seems to me to be there are all sorts of things that we take for granted reasonably which we cannot prove. I believe that there's a cup in front of me. If you ask me for evidence for that, I'll say, it certainly looks and feels and sounds to me as if there's a cup in front of me. If you ask with what justification I trust my senses here and now, I don't have much to say about that. That our senses are normally reliable and supply us with reasonably good information about what's going on around us is something that reasonable people believe, even if they can't give an argument for it. And in fact, if you tried to cite evidence for it, any argument you'd give would be circular because you would be taking the evidence of the senses for granted in giving the argument in the first place. So I have nothing against there being first principles from which we reason. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a principle which tells me which first principles are rationally acceptable and which aren't. I do think that in general, hypotheses about the invisible causes of visible things are never adequate first principles. So if some chemist told me, I take it as an unargued axiom that matter is composed of atoms, I would say, you may have reasons for believing that, but it can't possibly be the sort of thing that one can rationally accept on no grounds at all. That's the sort of thing that you need evidence for if it's going to be rationally acceptable. I think that hypotheses about the deity, insofar as they're causal hypotheses about why the world exists and is as it is, are like that. Maybe there's evidence for that hypothesis, maybe there isn't, but it's kind of thing that one can only rationally accept on the basis of evidence.
Can I make a comment on that? Because I think this question, do we have faith in reason, is very important. And I noticed you were nearly agreeing with Richard Dawkins' definition of faith as believing where there is no evidence.
I said, if that's what faith is,
well,
then I've got a lot of it.
Well, it is not what faith is. That's what blind faith is. Faith comes from the Latin fides, which means trust. And the basic ideas we all know. We ask the question of any kind of trust, what is the evidence? We'd be foolish to trust people without evidence. And especially after the banking crisis, I think we all know what evidence-based faith is, because we thought we could trust certain bankers and we discovered it didn't work. So it seems to me this is very important because, now I'm not referring to you now, Gideon, but one of the widespread feelings, certainly in Oxford with my colleagues, is this. Faith is a religious concept. It means believing where there's no evidence. Now, that is dangerously wrong in two directions. Firstly, other faiths must speak for themselves, but the Christian faith is the opposite of that. It claims, for instance, the Gospel of John, who wrote about the life of Jesus, he says, "These things I wrote that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name." In other words, here's the evidence, I'm writing it down. As far as I'm concerned, the Christian faith is a response to evidence. That's number one. But perhaps even more importantly in the context of the question is, this was Einstein's great problem. Many of my colleagues who are scientists do not realize that faith is utterly essential to science, because every scientist must believe as a prerequisite in the rational and mathematical intelligibility of the universe. And Einstein was clever enough to see that this created a problem. He said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And Wigner wrote a paper, Eugene Wigner, Nobel Prize winner in physics, talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that reason gives us insight into the world out there? Now, when I look at that from a worldview perspective, and I'll be very brief, it seems to me that here atheism undermines the whole project, because it tells me that the mind with which I'm doing the thinking is the brain, at least the extreme reductionists do. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, I submit to you, if you pick up your computer tomorrow morning and you knew it was the end result of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't use it anymore. Why should we trust the product of a mechanism that is itself the result of a mindless, unguided process? And Alvin Plantinga, I think, is one of the clearest writers on this, the very eminent North American philosopher, pointing out that this viewpoint is undermining not simply belief in God, it undermines every belief. It undermines the rationality we need to do science. On the other hand, the Judeo-Christian tradition gives you eminent reason for trusting your mind to do science. And the interesting thing is, it's arguable, very strongly arguable, I believe, that it was this view that led to the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. And that's why this university has got an open Bible and talks about flourishing intellectually under God. That's why Harvard is Veritas, Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ and the church, because in that era, it was the Christian cradle, the Judeo-Christian cradle, that was the motor that drove science. We forget that, I think, at our peril. So it seems to me that Christianity furnishes that rational warrant for doing science, whereas atheism undermines it completely.
I'm going to ask a series of questions that are all related for Professor Lennox and then do the same for Professor Rosen. So I'll just say them. Merely outweighing innocent suffering in this life with positive things in the next doesn't explain why suffering is allowed. It's not doing any good if it could have been left out and everything would be better. I guess the question is, how do you respond to that? If God is all good, how is post-death justification for suffering? You've only walked right into the problem and avoided the answer. If God is all good, there's no possible justification for suffering on this earth, if even in death better things are to come. That only says we suffer now for goods later. Mr. Lennox says there cannot be fire that does not burn, but if God can do anything, why can't he do this? Why can't there be justice without suffering? Please respond, I need to know. And then I'm coming to the end. You say that God eventually balances out all the injustices and pain of this world. Why does God cause these in the first place? Why not teach through positive things rather than through fear of punishment? Why did God start it all if he knew the outcome of so many suffering in this world? Why not just create a world with his followers who knew him and would choose him and be saved without suffering? And then finally, my sister is dying of a genetic disease that she was born with. She never had a chance at a decent life, even if she will be recompensated after her death. Why did she need to suffer in this life? She didn't do anything wrong.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, how many hours have we got? Because these are all very serious questions, and we can't begin to answer them. And let me say, I'm not God. You've realized that already. And Gideon has said a very interesting thing earlier. It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed picture. There is good. And on the hypothesis of atheism, you might wonder why there is so much of it. There is evil. And on the hypothesis of Christianity, you might wonder why there's so much of it. What I have tried to do in my life is to understand. I don't understand it completely. I don't begin to understand it. But I just see little glimpses here and there in the biblical revelation that give me great hope. But I am not prepared tonight to second-guess God. Because if the Apostle Paul says that the glory that is to come is by far overwhelmingly greater than the pain and suffering and decay that we see today, I see enough evidence in the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ to believe that. I see what he did in the small. Now you'll immediately object, why didn't he do it for everybody? The fact is he didn't. And there was a whole program announced by the Jewish prophets where there would be an eventual judgment, and there would be an eventual resurrection, and there would be a new heavens and a new earth, but they're not yet. And I think for me, taking all of those questions together, my heart goes out, of course, to the person whose sister is dying, because I lived along with exactly that with my niece. You may be interested to hear that my niece, who also, I feel, in that sense, had done no wrong, she didn't deserve to die as a newly married at the age of 22. But I want to tell you that she went to her death trusting in God. And her faith was the thing that has not only buoyed her up, but her husband up, and the wider family up. And that is, of course, what I would expect if it is true. There are mysteries and ragged edges. And I am going to go into eternity with many, many questions. And so the big question for me comes back to this. Is there anywhere enough evidence for me to trust God with those problems? And I believe there is, and it's to be found in the death and resurrection of Jesus.
A couple questions for Gideon. First, you use the problem of the suffering of innocence, but Christians don't believe anyone is innocent. How do you defend your premise that some are innocent? And do you need this premise for your argument?
Oh, just one? If Christians believe that small children who die of cancer deserve what they get thanks to original sin, I hardly know where to begin in objecting to the moral obtuseness.
I would agree with you, sir.
Of that idea. There is just no moral conception anywhere in the ballpark of sanity according to which the small child who suffers and dies of cancer deserves what she's getting.
So for Gideon as well, I wonder what your response is to all the beauty and order that we see in nature, equations, cycles, and the beauty of life. Do you not see an all-powerful being as the designer of it all? And maybe I'll add to it, what evidence do we have to believe that death is the end of everything?
If the question is the question, do I find the order and intelligibility of nature marvelous? Yes. Do I think it counts as evidence for the existence of an all-powerful God? No. But even if I thought that it did, and this brings us back to our proper topic, even if I thought that it's not just that there is an explanation for the order in nature that posits an all-powerful God, that's a good explanation, not just one of these I reach for this because I can't think of anything else explanations. Even if I thought that was a good explanation, I would think, so now I have evidence for an all-powerful God. Do I have evidence for a good God? No. If God made this world, and God is all-powerful, then the God who made this world tolerates the abominations we started with, the hideous suffering of the innocent. So this is a point Hume made extremely vividly and extremely well. If I were trying to work out the attributes of the deity, supposing there is one, from the world that I find, I would suppose that he is very powerful and very smart, and morally sort of hard to figure, but anything but perfect. He's responsible for some excellent things and for some abominable things. And to go back to the ethical problem that I started with, if that's the sort of God who is presented to us by this universe, a life organized around love for that God strikes me as, well, I can't think my way into it. So if one should trust in response to evidence and not blindly, and the evidence looks as it does to me, yes, let's suppose one man rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. That's a bit of evidence, evidence that there is something marvelous and supernatural in the world. If he's all-powerful, he is tolerating this. So he is morally hard to figure. To organize one's life around wholehearted love of that God is something I don't understand.
Professor Lennox, how would you respond to the claim that Jesus Christ is morally hard to figure?
Well, I don't know that I've anything to add to what I've already said this evening many times. I don't find him morally hard to figure at all, in the sense that, well, I'd not say I don't find it morally hard to figure at all. I find this whole question, as I've admitted at the beginning, a very deep and difficult one. But when it comes to Jesus Christ, I see what he is offering are the beginnings of a real solution to it. And I think the problem that arises in many people's minds is it wasn't on a big enough scale at the time. One person rises from the dead, as Gideon said. A few lepers are cleansed, and so on. But I do think that the evidence in the New Testament is part and parcel of the whole, that God has a great program for ultimately redeeming this universe. A lot of the bits of it, I've said this already, so there's no point in going into it again and again. A lot of it I don't understand. I can't second guess God. But I sit here on the opposite fence from Gideon. He feels there's not enough evidence. I feel there's overwhelming evidence in the Christian direction, and that atheism, his view, taken to its logical conclusion, undermines morality, rationality, and my own scientific endeavor. And therefore, it seems to me that in the end, we present our cases, and that's what we've been doing tonight, And it's marvelous to be able to do it in this kind of open and friendly atmosphere. And we must choose. In the end, each of us has got to choose what our worldview is. What makes most sense to you? What makes most sense to me? That's what I've tried to do all my life. And I've tried to be honest by exposing my faith in all parts of the world to its exact opposite. And what that has done has been to raise many questions that I can't answer, but it has served to confirm it in the things that I think open up when one considers particularly the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. I can't go beyond that in that sense, for obvious reasons.
I think this will be a good place for us to draw to a close. Maybe I'll allow Professor Rosen to respond in a similar vein in a concluding remark, maybe provoked by this question. Almost 100 years ago, Weber asked, how shall we live in a world where we are in an era of disenchantment? What would you say to this?
Nothing that would fit on a fortune cookie. How should we live? Do the right thing. And that means try to figure out what it is that you ought to do. You know quite a lot about that already, but what you know is imperfect. There are lots of moral questions you don't know the answer to. Moral reflection, philosophy, moral conversation is a way of improving the moral knowledge you've got. One thing we do know about the answer to this question, how shall we live, how should we live, is that it's very, very complicated. There are no simple precepts that are especially useful in making it through life. Don't cause gratuitous pain and suffering might be one of them. But in applying that principle, the question will always arise, what counts as gratuitous pain and suffering? And in answer to that sort of question, nothing I could tell you and nothing I could say would be especially useful. So my view is that secular morality and the secular theory of the good life, which includes secular morality and much more, is something that we begin to have access to simply by having been decently raised, as most of us have. And the project of improving that view is one that proceeds along broadly rational, ordinarily secular paths. And there may be moral wisdom in the religious traditions, but with Thomas Jefferson, I think that insofar as there is, it is separable from the supernatural content of those religions.
Well, I think we could keep going, and there are many topics we haven't raised that many of you asked questions about. We haven't addressed questions about the suffering of animals and all sorts of, and so this is the sort of conversation that does keep going. And I want to thank our speakers for allowing us to have a real dialogue and ask you to join me in doing and thanking them. Before you clap, I did want to mention my two favorite questions, or two of my favorite questions that I couldn't ask. And maybe we'll find out afterwards. For Gideon, do you shop at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's?
Wegmans.
Or both. Does the suffering of Dean's date and grade deflation make my salvation more or less likely? That's it. I think this is evidence of what happens when you bring a non-censorious atheist and a bird-walking Christian together.
Yes, I was announced as someone engaged in amateur bird watching, and somebody asked me, what is an amateur bird?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.